On a busy evening at Horizon Care Hospital, Nurse Emily Hart was going about her rounds like any typical night shift. That's when she began noticing something off about the respected Dr. Anderson, his secretive visits to a patient in a coma, his aggressive dismissals, and the mysterious vial he kept concealing in his pocket. It seemed like typical doctor eccentricity. But as she watched her patient's vitals mysteriously decline, something about Dr. Anderson's cold demeanor told a different story. What Emily would uncover in the following hours would shake her faith in the medical profession to its core and force her to choose between her career and a patient's life. Before we dive into this shocking story that will make you think twice about who's really caring for your loved ones in hospitals, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the corridors of Horizon Care Hospital as Nurse Emily Hart made her rounds during the late-night shift. The eerie calm that settled over the floor was punctuated only by the occasional beep of a monitor or the distant squeak of shoes on linoleum. Emily found herself in a patient's room, chatting with her colleague, Mia, as they went about their duties. Mia was replacing an IV infusion, her movements practiced and efficient. "Did you hear about Dr. Anderson's new intern?" Mia whispered, a hint of gossip in her voice. "Poor thing looks like she hasn't slept in days." Emily nodded sympathetically. "Dr. Anderson's reputation precedes him. I can't imagine what it must be like working directly under him." Dr. Samuel Anderson, the chief endocrinologist, was known throughout the hospital for his brilliance and his impossibly high standards. His demanding nature had become something of a legend among the staff. "I heard he made her redo an entire report because she used the wrong font," Mia continued, shaking her head. "Can you believe that?" Emily was about to respond when the quiet of the night was suddenly shattered. The sound of hurried footsteps and the rattling of a stretcher echoed through the hallway, growing louder by the second. Emily and Mia exchanged a glance before rushing out of the room to see what was happening. A team of paramedics burst through the doors, pushing a stretcher carrying an unconscious woman. Emily's training kicked in immediately as she moved to assist. "What do we have?" she asked, falling into step with the paramedics. "Dorothy Jackson, 55 years old," one of them replied breathlessly. "Found unconscious at home, blood sugars through the roof." Emily's heart sank as she took in the sight of the frail woman on the stretcher. Dorothy's skin was ashen, her breathing shallow. It was clear they were dealing with a critical situation. As they rushed Dorothy into the ER, Emily knew that the quiet night she had anticipated was about to become anything but. The emergency room erupted into a flurry of activity as Dorothy Jackson was wheeled in. Emily, now fully alert and focused, quickly reviewed the chart handed to her by the paramedic. The hastily scribbled notes painted a grim picture: severe dehydration, dangerously high blood glucose levels, and a suspected hyperosmolar coma state. Emily's experienced eyes took in Dorothy's condition. The woman's skin was dry and papery to the touch, her lips cracked and pale. Each shallow breath seemed to be a struggle. "Let's get her into Bay 3, Emily called out, directing the team to a treatment area, cordoned off by heavy blue curtains. The intimate space only served to heighten the tension as monitors were quickly hooked up and IVs prepared. Dr. Samuel Anderson strode into the bay, his presence immediately commanding attention. His eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned over Dorothy's form before he began issuing rapid-fire orders. "Start an insulin drip immediately," he instructed, his tone clipped and professional. "And get those fluids going. We need to rehydrate her as quickly as possible." As Emily moved to carry out the doctor's orders, the curtain was pushed aside, and three figures entered the cramped space. A man in his early 30s, his face etched with worry, stepped forward. "That's my mother," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Is she going to be okay?" Emily glanced at Dr. Anderson, who was still focused on Dorothy's chart. Taking it upon herself to address the family, she gently guided them to the side of the room. "Mr. Jackson?" she asked softly. The man nodded. "Malcolm, this is my wife Claire and our daughter Hannah." Claire stood close to Malcolm, cradling a young girl of about 7 in her arms. Hannah's eyes were wide with fear as she stared at her grandmother's still form. "Please, have a seat," Emily said, gesturing to a few chairs against the wall. "The doctor will be with you in a moment to explain everything." As the family settled, Dr. Anderson finally looked up from his chart. His gaze swept over the Jacksons before he addressed them, his tone matter-of-fact and slightly detached. "Mrs. Jackson is in a critical state," he began. "Her blood sugar levels are extremely elevated, likely due to a lapse in her diabetes management. Has she missed any medications recently? Or perhaps consumed a large amount of sugary foods?" Malcolm shook his head, looking lost. I don't know. I haven't been able to visit her as often as I should. She's been staying with my brother, but he's been out of town for a week now." Claire spoke up, her voice soft with guilt. "I saw her last week. She seemed fine, but I could tell she was lonely. I should have checked on her more often." Emily watched the family closely, noting the unspoken tensions and regrets that seemed to hang in the air. She saw Hannah tug at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Is Grandma going to be okay?" Sensing the child's distress, Emily knelt down to Hannah's eye level. "Your grandmother is very sick right now, but we're doing everything we can to help her," she said gently. "We have a playroom on the 3rd floor if you'd like somewhere to rest or play while we take care of her." Claire gave Emily a grateful look but shook her head. "Thank you, but I think we'll stay close for now." "As you wish, Mrs. Clare," Emily said. As she straightened up, she caught Dr. Anderson's eye. He gave her a curt nod, silently instructing her to finish up with the family. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, Hannah," Emily said gently. "I know this is a difficult time, but I assure you we're doing everything we can for Mrs. Jackson. The doctor will update you as soon as we have more information. In the meantime, if you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask for me at the nurses' station. My name is Emily Hart." As she finished recording Dorothy's information and signed the chart, Emily couldn't help but feel a pull of empathy toward the patient and her family. The unspoken guilt, the fear in young Hannah's eyes, and the gravity of Dorothy's condition all weighed heavily on her mind. As Emily made her way back to the nurses' station, memories of her own grandmother flooded her mind. 10 years ago, she had watched helplessly as diabetes ravaged her grandmother's body. Despite their best efforts, complications had set in, leading to a rapid decline. The image of her grandmother's frail form in the hospital bed, not unlike Dorothy Jackson's current state, was forever etched in Emily's memory. It was this personal experience that had largely influenced her decision to become a nurse, fueling her desire to help others facing similar battles. Lost in thought, Emily was startled when she heard Dr. Anderson call out to her. "Nurse Hart," he said, his tone brusque. "I'm assigning you as Mrs. Jackson's primary nurse for the duration of her stay." Emily blinked in surprise. It was unusual for Dr. Anderson to choose a nurse for this role, especially one who wasn't among the most senior staff. "Thank you, Dr. Anderson. It's an honor," she replied, trying to keep the confusion out of her voice. "I'll do my best to provide excellent care." "Good, you should, and I'm counting on it," he said. As Dr. Anderson walked away without another word, Emily felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. The responsibility was significant, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was somehow meant for her. Over the next few hours, Emily fell into a routine of caring for Dorothy. She monitored the patient's vitals closely, ensuring the IV fluids were administered correctly and checking her blood sugar levels at regular intervals. As she worked, she found herself talking softly to the unconscious woman, sharing snippets of her own life and memories of her grandmother. "You know, Mrs. Jackson," Emily murmured as she gently wiped Dorothy's forehead with a damp cloth, "my grandmother had diabetes too. She was the strongest woman I knew. I bet you're just as tough." "I should have been there more," Malcolm was saying all of a sudden, his voice thick with frustration and guilt. "Work always seemed so important, and now, God, I can't believe I let it come to this." Emily's heart ached for him. She understood all too well the regrets that came with losing touch with loved ones. Claire approached Malcolm, speaking in hushed tones. Don't be too hard on yourself, honey. Your mum has been battling diabetes for too long. She tied her hair up into a bun and yawned. Her daughter, Hannah, yawned too. Hannah and I need to head home. It's almost midnight and she has school tomorrow. You should get some rest too. Malcolm seemed reluctant but eventually nodded. You're right, you go first. Take the car with you. I can catch Uber later. I'll stay a little longer. Make sure Mum's okay. Once the family had gone and the night settled back into its quiet rhythm, Emily found herself at the nurse's station, poring over Dorothy's case file. She examined the woman's past health records, medication history, and recent blood glucose levels, trying to piece together a complete picture of her patient's condition. The more she read, the more Emily felt a deep sense of connection to Dorothy's case. The similarities to her grandmother's struggle with diabetes were striking, and Emily found herself growing increasingly invested in Dorothy's recovery. She set an alarm in her phone to check on Dorothy every few hours and memorized her chart and the medication she needed. Little did Emily know that this growing attachment would soon lead her down a path she never expected, one that would test her resolve, challenge her beliefs, and ultimately change the course of her career forever. 2 hours had passed since Emily's last check on Dorothy Jackson. The hospital corridors were quiet, save for the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional whisper of a passing nurse. Emily gathered her supplies and made her way back to Dorothy's room, ready to replace her IV fluid and administer another dose of insulin. As she entered the dimly lit room, Emily saw Malcolm still sitting by his mother's bedside, his hand resting gently on hers. He looked up at Emily's approach, hope and exhaustion warring in his eyes. "Any change?" he asked, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Emily checked the monitors and Dorothy's vitals. "Her condition is stabilizing," she said, offering a reassuring smile. "The treatment seems to be working, but it's a slow process. Mr. Jackson, you really should go home and get some rest. We'll call you if there's any significant change." Malcolm hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to stay and the logic of Emily's suggestion. Finally, he nodded, rising slowly from his chair. "You're right," he admitted. I hate leaving her alone." "She's not alone," Emily assured him. "I'll be checking on her regularly, and there's always someone nearby if she needs anything." With one last look at his mother, Malcolm reluctantly left the room. Emily watched him go, her heart heavy with empathy for his situation. As she turned back to continue her work, the door suddenly opened again. Dr. Anderson strode in, his presence filling the small room. Without acknowledging Emily, he began examining Dorothy, his movements brusque and efficient. "You can leave now, Nurse Hart," he said abruptly, not looking up from his examination. "I'll take it from here." Emily hesitated, surprised by the dismissal. It was unusual for a doctor to ask a nurse to leave during a patient check, especially the assigned primary nurse. "Dr. Anderson, are you sure? I was just about to—" "I said you can leave," he interrupted, his tone sharp and leaving no room for argument. Feeling both confused and slightly intimidated, Emily reluctantly made her way to the door. As she was about to exit, she heard Dr. Anderson muttering under his breath, his words too low to make out clearly. The tone, however, was unmistakably harsh and dismissive. Emily lingered near the doorway, her unease growing. Something about Dr. Anderson's behavior felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Before she could ponder it further, the door opened and Dr. Anderson emerged. His eyes narrowed when he saw her still standing there. "Nurse Hart," he snapped, "I don't appreciate staff hovering outside patient rooms. It's unprofessional and disruptive. Return to your station immediately." The other staff were watching her when she looked around, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Emily nodded and turned to leave. As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Dr. Anderson's behavior was more than just his usual brusqueness. There was an edge to it that left her feeling unsettled and suspicious. Emily had just settled back into her chair at the nurse's station, her mind still churning over Dr. Anderson's strange behavior, when a sudden commotion broke out. The harsh, urgent sound of a code blue alarm pierced the air, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her system. Without hesitation, Emily sprang to her feet and rushed towards the source of the alarm. She found herself in a neighboring room, where a team of nurses and doctors were already gathered around a patient in cardiac arrest. "We need epinephrine," someone shouted. "Charging to 200 joules," another voice called out. Emily jumped into action, assisting where she could. She helped apply the defibrillator pads as the team worked frantically to resuscitate the patient. The room was a flurry of activity, filled with the sounds of urgent commands and the rhythmic beep of medical equipment. Despite their best efforts, the patient's heart monitor continued to display a flat line. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the lead doctor called it. "Time of death, 3:47 a.m., he announced solemnly. A heavy silence fell over the room. Emily felt a wave of sadness wash over her, as it always did when they lost a patient. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself before heading back to her duties. As she exited the room, still shaken from the intense experience, something caught her eye. She saw Dr. Anderson entering Dorothy's room again down the corridor. Emily frowned, glancing at her watch. It had only been about 15 minutes since his last visit, and it wasn't time for Dorothy's next IV replacement. Emily hesitated, torn between her growing suspicion and her reluctance to question a senior doctor's actions. She found herself moving closer to Dorothy's room, driven by an instinct she couldn't quite explain. As she approached, she could hear Dr. Anderson's muffled voice from inside again, though she still couldn't make out the words. From the gaps between the shutter windows, she could see the doctor stood by the side of the table, holding Mrs. Dorothy hand up. Did he inject something? She wondered, but she couldn't see what he was doing. Her hand hovered over the door handle, her heart racing. Should she go in? Interrupt whatever was happening? The memory of Dr. Anderson's earlier rebuke made her pause. Before she could make a decision, the door opened suddenly and Dr. Anderson emerged. He startled at the sight of Emily, his expression quickly shifting from surprise to anger. "Nurse Hart," he snapped, his voice threatening. "What did I say about hovering? This is your last warning. If I catch you lingering around my patients' rooms again, I'll have you reassigned. Is that clear?" Emily nodded mutely, feeling a mixture of humiliation and defiance. As Dr. Anderson brushed past her, she caught a glimpse of something in his hand, a small clear ampule with a distinctive blue ribbon around its neck. Before she could get a better look, he quickly slipped it into his coat pocket and strode away. Left alone in the hallway, Emily felt her suspicion crystallize into something more concrete. The late-night visit, the hidden ampule, Dr. Anderson's aggressive behavior, it all added up to something that didn't feel right. As she paced back to the station, Emily's mind was racing. What was in that ampule? Why was Dr. Anderson being so secretive? And most importantly, what did all of this mean for Dorothy Jackson's care? Emily knew she was treading on dangerous ground. Questioning a doctor of Dr. Anderson's stature could have serious consequences for her career. But as she thought of Dorothy lying vulnerable in her hospital bed, Emily realized she couldn't simply ignore her suspicions. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as Emily stopped, turned, and made her way back to Mrs. Dorothy's room, her steps quick and purposeful. The encounter with Dr. Anderson had left her shaken, but her concern for her patient overrode any lingering fear. As she pushed open the door to Dorothy's room, the steady beep of the heart monitor greeted her. Emily's eyes immediately went to the various screens displaying Dorothy's vital signs, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Dorothy's heart rate had dropped suddenly and inexplicably. The woman's condition had been stabilizing earlier, and this abrupt change didn't align with the expected progression of her treatment. Moving swiftly to Dorothy's bedside, Emily began a thorough check of her patient's condition. As she leaned in close, she noticed signs that alarmed her further. Dorothy's lips and mouth were dry, clear indications of dehydration, as if her condition had not improved at all. This didn't make sense. The IV should have been providing adequate hydration. Emily's gaze traveled to the IV line, following its path from the bag of fluids down to where it entered Dorothy's arm. Everything looked to be in order, but something wasn't adding up. Making a quick decision, Emily carefully adjusted the IV flow, widening the knot on the hose slightly to allow for a faster drip. As she recorded her observations and actions in Dorothy's chart, Emily's mind wandered back to the mysterious ampule she had seen in Dr. Anderson's possession. The image of that small glass vial with its distinctive blue ribbon was burned into her memory. What's that bottle that Dr. Anderson carried? Could there be a connection between that ampule and Dorothy's sudden decline? But why? Someone of his stature won't dare to commit such a crime. The thought sent a chill down Emily's spine. She tried to rationalize, to tell herself that she was jumping to conclusions, but her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. But what could she do? She was a nurse relatively new to the hospital. Dr. Anderson was a respected endocrinologist with years of experience and a sterling reputation. Who would believe her suspicions over his expertise? Finishing her notes, Emily made her way out of the room. She sat down at the computer in her station, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she prepared to input Dorothy's updated information into the digital system. "I need more information on that bottle," she murmured. The clock on the wall seemed to move at an agonizingly slow pace as Emily waited for her break. When it finally arrived, she wasted no time and made her way towards the hospital pharmacy. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the doors. She glanced around to ensure no one was paying particular attention to her. Using her ID badge, she swiped into the pharmacy, trying to appear as casual as possible. The room was mercifully empty, the pharmacist likely on their break. Emily moved quickly to the computer terminal, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed the inventory system. She hoped to find a record of Dr. Anderson's recent medication orders, but to her frustration, she found her access restricted. The system wouldn't allow her to view other doctors' orders. Undeterred, Emily turned her attention to the shelves lining the walls. Row upon row of medications stared back at her, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed. Where should she even begin? Taking a deep breath, Emily focused on what she remembered about the ampule she had seen. It was small and clear, with a distinctive blue ribbon around the neck. With this image in mind, she began to scan the shelves methodically. Minutes ticked by, each second increasing the risk of discovery. Emily's palms began to sweat as she moved from shelf to shelf, her eyes darting back and forth, searching for anything that matched her memory. Just as she was about to give up, something caught her eye. On a lower shelf, partially hidden behind other medications, was a box of ampules. Emily's breath caught as she pulled it out. The label read Glycerin 60 ml, and each vial was marked with the same blue ribbon she had seen on Dr. Anderson's ampule. Emily frowned, her mind racing. Glycerin. She knew it was sometimes used for patients with constipation, but that certainly wasn't Dorothy's issue. In fact, for a patient with Dorothy's condition, severe dehydration and dangerously high blood sugar, glycerin could be extremely harmful. With trembling hands, Emily opened the box. The lid wasn't closed tightly, suggesting recent use. She quickly counted the vials inside. There were 15. As she stood there, holding the box of glycerin ampules, Emily felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. If this was indeed what Dr. Anderson had been administering to Dorothy, it could explain the patient's sudden decline, but why? Why would a respected endocrinologist deliberately harm a patient? The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway outside snapped Emily back to reality. Quickly, she replaced the box on the shelf, making sure it was in the exact position she had found it. She hurried out of the pharmacy, her mind whirling with this new, disturbing information. As she made her way back to her station, Emily knew she had crossed a line. She had gone beyond mere suspicion and taken steps to investigate a superior. If she was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation for all of this, her career could be over. But as she thought of Dorothy lying in her hospital bed, vulnerable and unaware of the danger she might be in, Emily knew she couldn't stop now. With each step, Emily's resolve strengthened. She would continue to watch, to gather evidence, and when the time was right, she would act. Dorothy's life might depend on it. The weight of her discovery pressed heavily on Emily's mind. As she settled back into her chair, Emily found herself replaying the events of the night in her mind. Dr. Anderson's strange dismissals, his reprimands, the mysterious ampule, and now Dorothy's unexplained drops in vitals. It all painted a picture that Emily found increasingly disturbing. The sense of isolation weighed on her. She was carrying a burden of knowledge and suspicion that felt too heavy to bear alone. Emily's eyes scanned the quiet hallway, landing on a familiar figure approaching the station. It was Mia, a fellow nurse and someone Emily had always found trustworthy, her only friends in this sterile, cold, professional space. Making a split-second decision, Emily stood up and caught Mia's attention. "Hey, Mia," she said in a low voice. "Can I talk to you for a minute, in private?" Mia nodded, looking slightly puzzled but willing. They moved to a quiet corner of the station, away from prying ears. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to share. "Mia, I think something's not right with Dr. Anderson and one of his patients," Emily began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love hospital gossips, especially about doctors. Tell me." Mia seemed cheerful, unaware of the weight of what Emily was going to reveal to her. Emily hushed. "Quiet, this is not a gossip. I think the new patient, Mrs. Dorothy, is in lethal danger." As Emily spoke, she watched Mia's expression change from curiosity to surprise, and then to skepticism. When Emily finished, Mia frowned, casting a concerned look at her colleague. "Emily," Mia said slowly, crossing her arms, "are you sure you're not overthinking this? Dr. Anderson's the chief endocrinologist. He's handled dozens of cases like Mrs. Jackson's. I know he can be tough, and it's your first time working under him, but he's always had the highest recovery rate in the department." Emily felt a flicker of frustration. She had hoped for validation, for someone to share her concerns. Instead, she felt even more isolated. "I know how it sounds," she pressed on, trying to keep her voice steady. "But you haven't seen what I've seen. The way he's acting, the unexplained changes in Mrs. Jackson's condition. Something's not right." Mia sighed, her expression a mix of sympathy and doubt. "Look, Emily, I get that you're concerned, but accusing Dr. Anderson of malpractice, that's a serious thing. Maybe there's a reason for using glycerin that we don't understand. We're nurses, not endocrinologists." Emily clenched her hands, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of her knew Mia was trying to be practical, to protect her from potentially ruining her career over a misunderstanding. But another part of her, the part that couldn't forget the vulnerability in Dorothy's unconscious face, refused to back down. "I know it sounds crazy," Emily admitted, her voice low and intense, "but what if I'm right? What if Mrs. Jackson is in real danger?" Mia's expression softened, but her words remained firm. "Emily, listen to me. I know you care about your patients. It's what makes you a great nurse, but you need to be careful. Throwing around accusations like this, it could end your career before it really begins, and if you're wrong, you could destroy Dr. Anderson's reputation, not to mention the hospital's." Emily fell silent, biting her lip. She knew Mia had a point, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't subside. Seeing Emily's continued doubt, Mia tried one last time to dissuade her. "Promise me you'll think long and hard before you do anything, Emily. I know your grandmother died of diabetes, so please, don't take this case personally. Sometimes things aren't as they seem. Don't throw away everything you've worked for on a hunch." With that final warning, Mia walked away, leaving Emily alone. The ticking of the clock filled the silence, a constant reminder of the lives that depended on their care. Emily sat there, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Mia's words echoed in her mind, logical and cautionary. But as she thought of Dorothy, lying vulnerable and unaware in her hospital bed, Emily knew she couldn't simply let this go. The shrill beep of Emily's alarm cut through the quiet in the corridor, startling her from her thoughts. She glanced at her watch, realizing it was time for another check on Dorothy. The first light of dawn had begun to creep in through the clouds, casting a pale bluish glow over the quiet corridors. Emily stood as she silenced her alarm. She felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was a steely resolve in her eyes. Glancing at the clock, Emily realized her shift would be over in an hour. She decided to make this final check on Dorothy before handing it over to the day shift. As she gathered her supplies and walked to Dorothy's room, she saw a glimpse of a tall man in white coat. A nagging thought made her pause. On impulse, she detoured to the pharmacy. Her heart raced as she approached the shelf where she had found the glycerin ampules earlier. With trembling hands, she pulled out the box and opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. There were now only 14 vials left. Panic surged through Emily. If Dr. Anderson had taken another ampule, it could only mean one thing. He was planning to administer it to Dorothy again. Without hesitation, Emily rushed out of the pharmacy, running down the corridor toward Dorothy's room. As she approached, she saw Mia nearby, preparing for her rounds. In a split-second decision, Emily called out to her, "Mia, Dr. Anderson's in Mrs. Dorothy's room." Confused but sensing the urgency in Emily's voice, Mia followed. She bursted into Dorothy's room just as Dr. Anderson was about to inject the needle into the infusion tube, a small ampule clutched in his hand. Emily's heart pounding. "Dr. Anderson, stop!" she cried out, her voice ringing with authority she didn't know she possessed. Dr. Anderson whirled around, surprise quickly morphing into anger on his face. "Nurse Hart, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Emily stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the ampule in his hand. "That's glycerin, isn't it?" she accused. "You've been giving it to Mrs. Jackson, even though it could kill her in her condition." Dr. Anderson's face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, trying to reach Dorothy's IV line, but Emily was faster, shoving his hand and gripping his wrist. In the struggle, the ampule slipped from his grasp and fell on the floor, luckily unbroken. The label was clear: glycerin 60 milliliters. Suddenly, Dorothy's heart monitor began to alarm, its shrill beep filling the room. Emily rushed to her patient's side, her training kicking in despite the chaos around her. Dorothy's heart rate was dropping rapidly, her body finally succumbing to the effects of the glycerin that had been secretly administered to her. As Mia called for a code blue, Emily locked eyes with Dr. Anderson. In that moment, she saw not the respected physician she had once admired, but a man consumed by some dark purpose she couldn't fathom. The room erupted into frenzied activity as the code team rushed in. Emily found herself pushed to the side, watching helplessly as they fought to stabilize Dorothy. In the commotion, she saw Dr. Anderson slip out of the room, clearly attempting to escape the consequences of his actions. Without hesitation, Emily gave chase. She couldn't let him get away, not now when the truth was finally coming to light. As she raced after him down the hospital corridor, Emily knew that the next few moments would change everything, for her, for Dorothy, and for Horizon Care Hospital itself. The hospital corridor became a blur as Emily chased after Dr. Anderson. The early morning quiet was shattered by the sound of running footsteps and Emily's voice echoing off the walls. "Stop! Dr. Anderson, stop right there!" she shouted, her voice carrying a mix of anger and desperation. Ahead of her, Dr. Anderson's white coat flapped as he ran, his attempt to escape growing more frantic with each step. But Emily was younger, fueled by adrenaline and righteous indignation. She was gaining on him. As they rounded a corner, Emily saw Mia up ahead, phone in hand. "Mia!" Emily called out. "Call security and the police!" Mia, still looking shocked by the unfolding events, nodded and began dialing. Dr. Anderson, seeing his escape route blocked by the closing lift door, skidded to a halt. He turned to face Emily, his face a mask of fury and fear. "You have no idea what you're doing, Nurse Hart," he snarled, his composure completely shattered. "You're ruining everything." Emily stood her ground, her chest heaving from the chase but her voice steady. "What I'm doing is protecting my patient," she retorted. "What were you thinking, Dr. Anderson? Administering glycerin to a severely dehydrated diabetic patient. You could have killed her." Dr. Anderson's eyes darted frantically, searching for an escape. The elevator doors were closing, and a crowd had gathered by the stairs, watching intently. Trapped, his expression shifted, and a sneer twisted his face as he spat. "You think you understand?" You're just a nurse. What do you know about the pressures of this job?" His words took on a bitter, mocking tone. Poor Mrs. Jackson, such a burden on her family. Do you know how much it costs her son to keep her alive? Her own son requested me to end her life most naturally. Emily felt a chill run down her spine at the callousness in his voice. "The family? Malcolm Jackson? No way, you're lying," Emily countered. Before she could respond, she heard a commotion behind her. Malcolm had arrived, likely called by the hospital due to the code blue. His face paled as he overheard Dr. Anderson's tirade. "What did you say about my mother? None of us wants her dead," Malcolm demanded, his hands clenching into fists. Dr. Anderson, clearly beyond the point of restraint, let out a bitter laugh. "Your mother? You know you're not her only son, or have you forgotten your brother? Your brother Brandon is my best friend, and I've watched him give up his time, missing out on life to care for her. Where were you then? Why step in to save your mother now? Always the same excuses about work." His voice grew colder as he continued. "Brandon told me everything, how much the medication had cost him. He asked me to do him a favor and end her life, make it look like some kind of accident. Brandon said that you and your family never visited. The last time was 2 years ago." Malcolm's face contorted with shock and rage. "What are you talking about? You're a doctor and Brandon's friend, and he asked you to kill our mother." Dr. Anderson sneered, his composure completely shattered. "Oh, don't act so surprised. Brandon's been carrying the burden alone for years. He's missed job opportunities and relationships, all to care for your mother. And where were you? Nowhere to be found." Emily stood frozen, horrified by the revelations, as if veins of darkness were creeping up from her feet, weaving their way toward the ceiling, enveloping the entire corridor in a shroud of grim revelation. The horrifying truth seemed to swallow her whole. "Dr. Anderson, are you saying you've been deliberately harming Mrs. Jackson?" Emily asked. The doctor turned his venomous gaze on Emily. "This is not all on me. I just helped provide him with the glycerin dose. Brandon tempered with her medication, and then he went out of town, so when Dorothy administered her insulin, well, we thought it would be quick, painless. A tragic accident, she fell into coma." Malcolm lunged forward, his face a mask of fury and anguish. "You bastard! How could you? How could Brandon?" Emily quickly stepped between them, her arms outstretched. "Mr. Jackson, please, we need to focus on your mother right now. She needs help, not more violence." Just then, hospital security arrived, alerted by Mia's call. They quickly moved to separate Dr. Anderson and Malcolm, preventing any physical altercation. Dr. Anderson, however, seemed beyond reason. He continued his tirade, his words becoming increasingly offensive. "You have no idea what it's like," he spat, his face red with anger. "Dealing with people like you, always complaining, never following instructions, never caring beyond your busy schedule, but acting like heroes when your loved ones are on the deathbed. You're a drain on the system." Emily watched in horror as Dr. Anderson's meticulously crafted professional image shattered before her. His justification for committing the crime, to fulfill a request from his best friend, Dorothy's son, unveiled a deep-seated false sense of justice and humanity she'd never have expected from the esteemed physician. Malcolm struggled against the security guard holding him back, his voice shaking with fury. "You're a trash bastard." Dr. Anderson laughed coldly. "Call me whatever you like, but now you know the truth, and your negligence is part of this. That guilt should haunt you for the rest of your life." Before the situation could escalate further, the elevator doors opened, and 2 police officers stepped out. They had been summoned by Mia's 911 call and quickly took in the scene before them. "What's going on here?" one of the officers demanded, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. Emily stepped forward, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I'm Nurse Emily Hart. I've witnessed Dr. Anderson here deliberately administering harmful medication to a patient, Mrs. Dorothy Jackson. He's been using glycerin, which is dangerous for her condition." The officers exchanged a glance before one of them moved towards Dr. Anderson. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. You have the right to remain silent." As the officer read Dr. Anderson his rights, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. The truth was finally coming to light, but her relief was short-lived as she remembered Dorothy's critical condition. "Mr. Jackson," she said, turning to Malcolm, "we need to get back to your mother. The medical team is working to stabilize her, but she'll need all our support." Malcolm nodded, the anger in his eyes giving way to worry. As they hurried back towards Dorothy's room, Emily could hear Dr. Anderson's voice fading behind them, still hurling threats and insults. "You'll regret this, Nurse Hart," he shouted. "I'll make sure you never work in this field again." Emily ignored his threats, focusing instead on the task at hand. As they approached Dorothy's room, she saw that the code team was still working feverishly. Dr. Lisa Chen, the on-call cardiologist, was leading the efforts to stabilize Dorothy. "What's her status?" Emily asked, stepping up to assist. Dr. Chen glanced up, her face etched with concentration. "We've managed to bring her heart rate up, but she's not out of the woods yet. Whatever that glycerin did, it's wreaked havoc on her system." Emily quickly briefed Dr. Chen on what had transpired with Dr. Anderson. The cardiologist's eyes widened in disbelief, but she quickly refocused on the task at hand. "All right, let's counteract this," Dr. Chen said decisively. "We need to flush her system and get her blood sugar under control. Emily, I want you to stay on top of her vitals. Mr. Jackson, please wait outside. We'll update you as soon as we can." Malcolm hesitated, his eyes fixed on his mother's pale face. Emily gently guided him to the door. "I promise we'll do everything we can," she assured him. As Malcolm reluctantly left the room, Emily threw herself into her work. For the next hour, she moved in perfect sync with the medical team, anticipating needs, monitoring changes, and providing crucial information about Dorothy's medical history and the events of the night. Slowly but surely, Dorothy's condition began to stabilize. Her heart rate steadied, her blood sugar levels started to come down, and her breathing became less labored. As the crisis passed, the room gradually emptied until only Emily, Dr. Chen, and one other nurse remained. Dr. Chen placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You did good work tonight, Nurse Hart. Not just in here, but in uncovering what Dr. Anderson was doing. You probably saved Mrs. Jackson's life." Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The adrenaline that had been keeping her going was starting to wear off, leaving her feeling drained but relieved. "Thank you, Dr. Chen. I couldn't ignore what I was seeing." "That's what makes a great nurse," Dr. Chen said with a smile. "Now, why don't you go update the family? I think he had waited long enough." Emily nodded and headed to the waiting area, where she found Malcolm pacing anxiously. Claire and Hannah sat huddled together on a nearby chair. Hannah was still in her pajamas, and Claire wore the same clothes from the night before. As soon as Malcolm spotted her, he rushed over. "How is she? Is my mom okay?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. Emily allowed herself a small smile. "She's stable now, Mr. Jackson. We've managed to counteract the glycerin's effects and control her condition. She's not completely out of danger yet, but things look much better." The relief on Malcolm's face was palpable. He sagged against the wall, tears welling up in his eyes. Claire came over, wrapping an arm around her husband, while Hannah clung to her side. "Can we see her?" Claire asked softly. Emily nodded. "Of course, she's still in her coma state, but I think having you there will help. Follow me." As Emily guided the family back to Dorothy's room, a sense of accomplishment mixed with the heavy weight of the night's revelations. Dr. Anderson's confession that Malcolm's brother had requested their mother's death was almost too much to comprehend. Her thoughts drifted to her own grandmother, lying on her deathbed years ago, and she couldn't fathom anyone in her family ever making such a request. At that time, she'd been in her final year of college, juggling internships, exams, and the journey toward her license. It had been a chaotic period, but even in her busiest moments, she'd made time to visit her grandmother. She couldn't imagine choosing otherwise. The corridor, softly lit by the dawn, seemed changed somehow. Nurses and doctors nodded to her as she passed, their gazes filled with a blend of respect and curiosity. Word of what had unfolded had clearly spread quickly. Emily made her way to the nurse's station, her steps heavy with exhaustion. She signed off on her charts and handed over her patients to the day shift nurse, briefly explaining Dorothy's condition and the events surrounding Dr. Anderson. "Well done, Emily," a nurse said. "What a courage," another said. "You did good, Emily," Mia said, squeezing her arm supportively. "Not many would have had the courage to do what you did." Emily managed a tired smile in response. "Thank you, Mia, for believing in me. You showed that today when you rang the code blue alarm and called the police." "I'm always in your corner," Mia said with a grin. "Now we finally have some real gossip about the doctor." She chuckled, and as Emily saw her smile, she realized just how much she needed that. There's only so much negativity one can handle in a night. As Emily gathered her things, she reflected on the night's events. The fear and doubt she had felt seemed distant now, overshadowed by the knowledge that she had made the right choice. She had stood up for her patient, and it was more than just doing her job, it was fulfilling the true calling of a nurse. She knew there would be more questions and more explanations needed in the days to come, but for now all she wanted was to go home and process everything that had happened. As she walked out of the hospital doors, Emily allowed herself a small smile. She was exhausted, yes, but she was also proud of what she had accomplished and excited for what lay ahead. Because she knew that as long as there were patients who needed her, she would be there, ready to make a difference, one life at a time.